Now that we've set up Craft to receive GraphQL requests on the back end, it's now time to set up our front-end client to actually send those GraphQL requests. And you can do this with vanilla JavaScript if you want to. You can send a fetch request and get back a promise, and that'll work totally fine. But for data fetching like this, I prefer to use a library because it just makes the setup that much easier and faster. And then Apollo Client is a really great GraphQL library that also is designed to work with specifically with React projects. And it's also got a lot of great features that are going to help us out when we get to the stage of doing our search filtering and our category filtering and our pagination. It's got a lot of options for us that are going to make the build move a lot more quickly. So we're just going to use Apollo Client here. And to do that, we're going to install it using a package manager. And I am using NPM, but you can use Yarn or whatever package manager you happen to like to use. So we're going to go Apollo Client GraphQL RxJS. So we're installing the Apollo Client, the GraphQL library, and RxJS, which is going to allow Apollo to work in React. Go ahead and install those. Now that we have installed our Apollo Client library, we're going to set up our Apollo query container. And I'm going to do it a little bit different than is recommended in the Apollo docs. I'm going to break this up into smaller pieces, and that's going to keep our project a little bit more organized. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new directory in my source folder called data. And inside that, I'm going to create a new file called query cache. And it's going to be a JS file. You can use TypeScript if you want to. I am not using TypeScript for this tutorial just because I want to keep it as simple as possible. And we're going to import a class called InMemoryCache from Apollo. And then we're going to just initialize a new instance of that class. I'm going to call it query cache, new InMemoryCache. And this is a class that is going to allow Apollo to cache any of the data that it receives from our Craft site. And that's going to make, when we're doing manipulations on the React side, it's going to make it move a lot faster because it doesn't have to keep refetching data over and over. It's just going to use what it already has saved in local storage. Then we're just going to export this so that we can use it elsewhere in our app. So next, we're going to create a query client. So we're going to create a new file called query client. All right, and we're going to import Apollo client and something called HTTP link from Apollo client. And then we're also going to import our query cache that we just created. And then we're going to create a new instance. Whoops. Query client, new Apollo client. And so this is where we're actually going to build our connection to our client backend. So we're going to tell Apollo where our endpoint is. We're going to say link. And that is new HTTP link, which is that class that we imported from Apollo. And then inside HTTP link, we're going to give it a URI, which is the endpoint for our GraphQL install. And so for me, that is Headless Craft SB backend.ddev. So we'll just paste that in. And then Craft already has a default GraphQL endpoint installed and ready to go, and that is located at index.php query action GraphQL /API. The next thing we have to do is pass in some headers, and this is where we're going to pass in our token that we generated so that when we access this GraphQL endpoint, GraphQL knows which schema we're trying to access. And so we're going to go back into our control panel and we're going to go to where we built our token. And so it's our Next.js app token that we created. We'll just go ahead and copy that. And paste that in. And I'll put this in quotes. Okay, And the last thing we're going to pass into our client class is the cache that we created in our other file and imported. So that's our query cache. So we're just going to pass that in. And that's how our Apollo client is going to know where to store the data that it has received from this request. And then we're just going to export this because we're going to use it elsewhere. Query client. All right. Now the last step is to add the Apollo provider to our app container. Now I'm using Next.js, and I'm using Next.js with the pages router. And so for me, my top level app entry point is located at pages and app.js. If you're using the Next.js app router, this is going to be slightly different for you. If you're using a different framework or you're not using a framework at all, we're putting this wherever your top level entry point for your app exists. This is a context container that we're wrapping around our top level component. You can add an Apollo provider deeper down in your app if you want to, but for our purposes, it's easiest to just have it as high as possible so that our Apollo client is available to us in every part of our app. So to do that, we're going to import the Apollo provider. And that's a component that Apollo provides for us. And then we're going to import the query client that we just made. All right. Now here is my top level Next.js component. So that's my app entry point. So now we're just going to wrap that entry point component with our Apollo provider component. Apollo provider. And we're going to pass in as a prop client, which is the query client that we created. And so that's what this provider is going to use when we make our GraphQL query. It's going to use that client that we created. I'll just close that up. All right. Now, if we're lucky, we'll go ahead and check and make sure that this is all working well. Good. Not getting any console errors. All right. So we are all set up and ready to go to start making GraphQL requests from our React front end, which we are going to cover in the next tutorial.